feel free to adjust anything
Okay.
as you want.
Yeah.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much to our crew back there for navigating the AV system, which I know has been acting up today. So thank you for getting us all set up, and thank you all for your patience and waiting, and most importantly for being here for this conversation, which I, for one, am really excited to have with you, Sammy. So you hopefully heard when Sammy and his fiancée, soon-to-be Rabbi Leah Julian, and your grandfather, Rabbi Harry Roth, came up for the Aliyah. Yom Holedet Sameach, Rabbi Roth. But I'll just, by way of introduction, once again give you this man's credentials because they're good, so I don't want to pass over them. So Sammy's the climate columnist for the LA Times, where he writes the weekly Boiling Point newsletter. Excellent newsletter.
Thank you. I will say it's actually twice weekly now. It's twice as much work. No, it's great.
So that happened in the time we were waiting, just like that. All right, more to read, which is exciting, and your writing really focuses on energy solutions, the transition away from fossil fuel. You previously reported for the Desert Sun and USA Today, where you had a similar focus. And I want to say that in some ways this is also a very timely conversation for our community when we think about where we are in the Jewish calendar, having just celebrated Tu B'Shvat this week. But I also, while saying that, want to push back against that. Because sometimes we, as the Jewish community, make the mistake of only talking about these issues on or around Tu B'Shvat. Right? And the fact of the matter is, the time to care about the future and the now of our planet and ecosystems and energy systems and how they intersect with all of the other systems out there is not a once-a-year conversation. It's not something that we check off of a checklist when we get to Tu B'Shvat. And so my hope is that the conversation that we have today, for many of you in this room, I know, with special shout out to Brooke, our Director of Community Organizing, and to our Green Action team for the year-round work that you do on this. And I really hope that this conversation will also inspire folks who are not already involved in that work or with the Green Action to get involved, because this really is an urgent and timely conversation, and the work is year-round.
I just want to say, I not only do I agree with that, it's become a little bit of a cliche in environmental circles to say every day is Earth Day, but people will sometimes ask me, oh, what are you writing for Earth Day? And I kind of laugh like, well, read me every week of the year, and this is what we're talking about. So right. I agree with you. It can't just be one day, one time. It needs to be all the time.
All right, thank you. So Sammy, I want to get started with a very specific question that's linked to the reporting that you have recently done and an article that you recently published in the LA Times newsletter, The Boiling Point, that I mentioned, which explores a particular renewable energy project in the Imperial Valley, a project that taps into geothermal energy production and lithium production. And I'm starting with a very specific question, a very specific story, because I want people to get a sense for the kinds of projects that you're paying attention to, and I want them to hear the story of this particular project. But also because I think that in exploring this particular project, you might raise our awareness around some of the complicated and complex issues that are involved in renewable energy projects. And so I'll ask you to start by telling the specific story and then drawing some of the larger pictures of the grays here.
Sure. So, I mean, I've been writing about renewable energy going on about 10 years now, and I think solar and wind energy are pretty well known as climate change solutions, and for good reason. There's a lot of them, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But geothermal energy is really interesting because, unlike solar and wind, it's not time of day dependent. You don't need the sun to be shining or the wind to be blowing. There's various places, especially in the western United States, where there are these deep, sort of naturally occurring pockets of underground heat that companies can drill down into and bring up this superheated sort of steam and use it to spin a turbine and make electricity, and it's good 24 hours a day, and it doesn't emit carbon or contribute to climate change. So I've been, honestly, since I started doing this almost 10 years ago, I've been going down to this spot in the Imperial Valley by the Salton Sea in the southeastern part of California, where there have been a bunch of geothermal plants for the last 20, 30, 40 years. And there haven't been any new ones built anytime recently because it's more expensive than solar and wind and other forms of electricity. It has high upfront capital costs, basically, to figure out where to drill and then to actually drill down. But there's increasingly a need for it because we need to keep the lights on without fossil fuels, and we need to do it when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. And hey, there's this great geothermal field with a lot of untapped potential. So I've been down there a whole bunch of times, and what's really sort of driving it forward now is, in addition to the geothermal, which, as I said, can be expensive and a little more difficult to make money on, dissolved in this underground pocket of superheated fluid is a bunch of lithium. And if you've heard of lithium, it's probably because it's really important for the batteries in electric vehicles, which are lithium-ion batteries, and also for the lithium-ion batteries on the power grid that we're increasingly using to store solar and wind power for times, after the sun goes down or when it's not windy. So there's been this kind of gold rush down. Actually, people call lithium white gold. So there's been this kind of white gold rush down there of, companies looking to break into this field. And finally, this week, yesterday, in fact, one of these companies finally was able to raise the capital and sign the contracts after working on this for literally the last dozen years. I think I first wrote about them 8 years ago. And they finally have broken ground. They've drilled some wells. They're starting large-scale construction on a project that's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's, in many ways, great news from a climate perspective. This is renewable energy. It's lithium that we need. There's a lot of support for the jobs that it's going to generate and the tax revenues that it's going to generate in Imperial County, California, which is a very low-income place with a very heavy Latino population. I think it's like 80% Latino and some of the lowest median incomes in California. So, economically, this could be really great. And I think one of the reasons probably you asked about this is that in addition to all of these benefits and positives, there have definitely been concerns raised by some people in this community. How much water is it going to use? This is a water-stressed region. The truck traffic that construction is going to generate, what's that going to mean for dust emissions in a place that's already heavily polluted? Are there going to be impacts to the quality of the water in the region from this project? Not everyone would agree with what I'm about to say necessarily, but I would say that relative to some of the other issues that come up with other types of renewable energy projects, these seem like hopefully they'll be reasonably manageable, but it's sort of a reminder, and I've spent a lot of time writing about this, that every climate change solution, there's nothing perfect. Everything's got its flaws. With big solar farms, they take up lots of land and can disrupt wildlife habitat and wildlife migration. With big wind turbines, birds can get chopped up flying through them. Basically, everywhere you look, there's not a perfect solution to replace fossil fuels. So something that I focus on a lot in my work is how do we navigate the inevitable imperfections and get to a point where we do what we need to do on climate change with relatively minimal as little damage as possible elsewhere, and do it in a way that hopefully lifts up, if not all communities and every person and every animal everywhere, that as many as possible, and sort of has the greatest co-benefits along with the climate benefits.
So, Sammy, part of what you just said, which really catches my attention, and I also see this in your writing, there's already a starting place which I think many of us need to be reminded of, which is that it isn't as simple as saying renewable energy projects are good and fossil fuel is bad. It might be simple to say fossil fuel is bad, but renewable energy projects are complicated, and there's different aspects of these projects that need to be evaluated by the different people who are involved, and might lead in a particular project to the conclusion that despite the benefits that this would bring in terms of weaning from fossil fuel, it's not actually a project that should be pursued. So you started to speak about it in terms of air pollution and impact to wildlife and ecosystems, but could you speak, what are the kinds of issues that have been raised when evaluating these sorts of projects that you've seen through your reporting over the years, and what have you seen to be responsible ways forward or irresponsible ways forward?
Well, I mean, just to start with the comment you made that it's not as simple as renewables are good and fossil fuels are bad. No, of course it's not. I mean, not of course. This is maybe not. Not everyone has tracked this closely. I mean, I know it's what I write about. But yeah, no, it's not that simple. I mean, fossil fuels, we need to find a way to stop burning them. They're causing all sorts of harm, both to the the climate, with hugely disproportionate impacts on low-income communities and people of color who are getting the worst of this in other nations and in our own. We need to figure that out quickly. But on the renewable side of things, I've spent all sorts of time looking at solar projects that are getting built in sensitive habitat for desert tortoises, which are an endangered species or threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and which have faced all sorts of damage from industrial development in the western United States and elsewhere. And this is sort of another added threat to them. It's there are a lot of Native American tribes for whom the landscapes on which these projects are getting built are considered sacred, and there's various historical artifacts and sites that are culturally important to them, either for gathering food and plants or for other reasons. And when I started writing about energy at the Desert Sun newspaper in Palm Springs in 2014, some of the first groundbreakings of projects that I went to in the desert, like I had so little understanding of the fact that it was more complicated. There were tribes out there at these groundbreaking ceremonies who were sort of doing dedications to this land, sort of in mourning for it. And that just struck me as, wow, that's so interesting. Like, I wonder what's going on here. Should I be more concerned about this than I was previously? So there's every technology has stuff, So to get at your question, how do we move forward in the best way possible? There are, one, with the large-scale renewable energy projects, there are many environmental groups that are doing very good work, I think, sort of trying to map out across the landscape and figure out what are the least sensitive places to build, where are there landscapes that have already been disturbed by other industrial development or by ranching or habitat degradation of various times, mining, other land uses. How can we focus our efforts there? If it raises the costs, maybe that's not the end of the world, but are there ways to help lower some of those costs so that it doesn't translate to higher electricity prices for people? Also, just to the extent that we can put solar on rooftops and homes and businesses and warehouses and other places within cities, that's a huge benefit as well. Also controversial, like I said, there's no energy solution without some flaws. There's been all sorts of debate at the state level over whether the way we've subsidized rooftop solar is inadvertently raising electricity rates for people who can't afford to put solar on their roofs and who thus might be suffering as a result. There's a very long conversation that we could have about that if you wanted to, and I've written far too many stories on that topic. But it's all a balance, and clearly we need to be cognizant that every technology comes with downsides, and we're in a position where we very badly need to solve climate change, but we can't just ignore the fact that just because something doesn't emit carbon dioxide that it's perfect, and we should ignore the rest of it.
So I'm thinking about the average person, right, who's reading your reporting, who shares your assessment and understands that there's an urgency to the shift in energy production, but who feels, and I certainly feel this often, right, a degree of powerlessness when it comes to moving the needle on the topics that we're discussing, right? And you've thrown us right into the nitty-gritty, which I asked you to do.
Yes, my defense is that you asked me to.
Yeah. I know that's on me. But the majority of us, right, who are not tracking the particular projects, but who want to advance this cause, what is the role that the average citizen can play? Is there a role to be played in particular projects like the one that you mentioned, or are there other avenues of individual action or of community organizing that the average citizen can get involved with that you think is effective in this moment in time?
Sure. I would say a couple things, and I would start with maybe the obvious one, which is to the extent that there are changes and actions you can take in your own life in terms of your, the choices of what you buy and what you spend money on and how you get around, that can certainly be valuable to the extent that you are in a position to or able to whether it's driving an electric car or taking public transit or, walking as you're able to, those are all valuable steps. Eating less beef, which is a huge carbon contributor. If you're able to afford solar panels to put them on your roof, that's big. And I think that individual action is valuable. I mean, it can feel small in the grand scheme of things, and ultimately it is only a tiny piece, but I think it's especially valuable to the extent that you talk about it, you talk with your friends and family, and you can sort of use it as a way to build momentum in the communities you're in, to show people the actions you're taking and to sort of get others on board with it. I mean, with rooftop solar, there's really excellent research that shows that one of the greatest factors, if not the greatest factor in determining whether an area gets a lot of rooftop solar is, people see their neighbors doing it and want to do it themselves, even more so than the economics. Sometimes that can be a huge driving factor, is whether your neighbors have already gone that route. So to the extent that you can build momentum in your life and in your community with others, that's huge. All of that said, and I bring this up almost any time that question is asked, the concept of a personal carbon footprint, the idea how much carbon do you emit in your own life that contributes to climate change, that's a concept that was really popularized by the oil company BP. Maybe you've heard that before, as kind of a way of shedding responsibility for their role in getting us to this point and sort of putting it on the consumer. It's like, well, it's your fault. You're buying gas, so this is really on you, not on us. We're just meeting your needs. And so I think that it's important that we not get lost in the idea that, this is just on our shoulders as individuals, and if we're driving a gasoline car still because that's what our situation demands of us, or if we're still eating hamburgers once in a while, that therefore we have no claim to responsibility or no ability to impact the problem in other ways. We definitely, that doesn't make us the villain necessarily. That doesn't mean that we can't take action here. Big picture, talking about political change and advocacy, I really do think that we could get to really serious, really significant and really positive climate action on the basis of politics if we had the right level of support for this stuff. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed Congress and which President Biden signed in 2022, was huge. That was the biggest climate law by far ever passed. There were $370 billion in there for climate and clean energy initiatives. It's not going to do everything. We still need to accelerate quite a bit more if we're going to stay within global climate targets, but it's huge, and that was a result of people pushing for that. I mean, it took every Democrat in Congress just about voting for it. I don't think it got a single Republican vote, but that happened, and it's a sign that action is possible. And so I think that the work that you're doing here in IKAR with the Green Action Team, and that especially the attention being paid to the impacts of the non-climate impacts of fossil fuels as well, the air pollution, the impacts. And my understanding is that your Green Action Team has started to work on pushing out urban oil drilling in the Inglewood oil field here in West Los Angeles and in other spaces. There's a really good argument to be made that one of the best ways to get people motivated to be involved in this work isn't just talking about climate change, which, while real and serious with fires and heat waves and droughts and floods, can kind of feel abstract and distant, whereas if you've got oil and gas being drilled for in your neighborhood, that's emitting pollution that you're breathing right here. Same with freeways and living near freeways, which is one of the most damaging things that can happen to your health if you live within a mile of a freeway. So to the extent we can work on those aspects and talk about those aspects of the problem, I think that can get people really motivated as well and help to build for larger political change.
There's so much to respond to in that. So I wanna come back to the sort of nefarious role that some of these big companies have played in I want to say polluting the narrative. Maybe not the right language, but right in really feeding misinformation to the public about everything from the reality of climate change to where the core responsibilities lie. But since so that's my way of saying we'll come back to that.
But since I told you 6 different things there, and okay.
Well, it's great. It's great. I want to actually start with where you ended, because it's, as you said, it's a project that's near and dear to this community. So, led by our Green Action Team, we are working right now to defeat the statewide measure on the November ballot that would overturn the state law that we advocated for, SB 1137, whose purpose was to stop drilling of new oil wells in urban areas next to people's homes, schools, parks,
What was
communities.
the setback distance? Remind me, was it half a mile or 2,000 feet? It was something. 2,500. Thank you.
Right. So this was a win, right, on the local level, and signed by the governor, and now we see it in referendum form on the ballot in November to overturn the victory that we thought we had achieved, and if I remember correctly, unanimously had achieved. And so, from your vantage point, right, as a reporter, looking at the different factors that, and the different parties and the different sources of money and the different interests that get involved to try to overturn something like what was passed in this past year, how do you see this political fight shaping up? Who are the players, and what do you see from your vantage point?
Yeah, I mean, my recollection is that the major oil companies that operate in California and the major oil trade associations here, funded the signature gathering for that ballot initiative and put it on the ballot. I don't think they've spent all that much money on advertising yet, but I'm sure that'll come over the next few months. It's going to be on the November ballot, right? No ballot number yet? Okay. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a reminder that California is still a major oil-producing state. We don't produce as much as we did 40 years ago. It continues to decline, but especially in the San Joaquin Valley and in Kern County, not that far from north of here, oil is still a major economic engine and a provider of jobs and a provider of tax revenues for those counties. And that doesn't mean we don't need to figure out ways to get off of it. We do desperately. But to me, that's what this ballot measure is a reminder of. It's a reminder that there's still a lot of money in this. There's still a lot of people who benefit from it. And just because we're in California doesn't mean the politics of this are always going to be easy.
In some of the let's call them more complicated renewable energy projects, could you speak to who the players are? So you just sort of fleshed it out with respect to a big fossil fuel interest, but who are some of the people who come to the table and who have competing interests with respect to renewable energy projects?
You're talking about who are the big renewable energy developers?
What are the different voices that are in competition with one another when either trying to advance or pull back on a renewable energy project?
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess on the corporate side, there are definitely companies that have gotten pretty big and pretty profitable building solar and wind and long distance power lines. NextEra Energy, which is based in Florida, I think has probably done the most big solar farms out here in California. First Solar from Phoenix is another big one. On the wind energy side, actually, most of the best windy spots in California got built out in like the 1980s and 90s and are now being upgraded with newer, bigger models. But when California is looking for more wind energy, and especially wind that can serve us at times of day when we really need electricity now, which is on evenings in the summer when it's hot and the sun goes down, there's actually a lot of wind development happening out of state that's designed to serve California. There was just a big power line that started construction in New Mexico that's going to help us. Company is SunZia that's doing that one. They're building hundreds and hundreds of wind turbines out on the plains in New Mexico to help us keep the lights on here after dark and a power line to go with it. And I've actually been up a couple times to southern Wyoming, which has some of the strongest evening wind resources. And this billionaire named Phil Anschutz, who actually got his start in oil and gas, also owns the Staples Center. I know it's called something different now, the crypto, and the LA Kings hockey team and all sorts of other stuff, and got his start in oil and gas, actually. He's now building a big wind farm in Wyoming, along with a power line that's 730 miles, the route of which I've traveled or attempted to travel as close as possible to get wind energy to California. So there are definitely some big players and some big companies in the space that have realized there's a profit to be made. And, if you're against all big corporations making big profits, and I'm not saying that's an untenable position, but that probably looks problematic to you, but it's certainly getting us some of the renewable energy we need. And on the other side of this equation, there are a lot of major environmental nonprofits that are very gung-ho about building more renewables, but also want to be careful about where we put it. I've written a lot about groups like the Nature Conservancy and the Wilderness Society and the Sierra Club and others that are in favor of this stuff, but have also done a lot of really interesting sort of on-the-ground mapping exercises and trying to help government and help companies. And the state of California has worked on this too. In fact, the Biden administration, the Bureau of Land Management, which manages a couple 100 million acres of land in the western United States. I'm just be writing a piece this week. They're doing their own sort of large-scale exercise, looking at public lands all over the western United States, trying to figure out what are the places we should be putting this stuff, what are the areas we should be protecting, What are places that, are maybe in the middle that we should be willing to take a hard look at, but maybe say no later? There's a lot of work happening in that space, and that's the environmental side of it. There's also just a lot of people in rural towns all over the country, and I focus on the West, but all over the country who, for reasons that you might consider good or bad, they don't want to look at wind turbines, or they feel like a solar farm or a power line is going to hurt the sort of small town, peaceful, quiet charm that they like in their community, and don't want this stuff being built and bulldozed in their backyards. And that has proven a barrier to a lot of renewable energy development too. So I think that for those of us who badly want to solve the climate crisis, or limit the climate crisis, I should say, especially here in Los Angeles, where we do use lots of power, one, the less electricity we can use, the better, and two, I think we need to take seriously the fact that there are people at the other ends of these power lines who, for reasons we may or may not agree with, don't want to see this stuff get built, but, just one, on an ethical basis, and two, on a practical basis, we need to take that seriously and engage with that if we want to move forward.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the disproportionate impact of many of the fossil fuel projects and of climate change more generally on indigenous communities, people of color. So can you speak to how the voices of those communities are being represented in the conversations around renewable energy projects, and what we can do to amplify those voices?
Sure. So, I guess I would want to say, first of all, that, their voices are fortunately increasingly, and hopefully even more so in the future, being taken into account on the fossil fuel side of the conversation. Right here in Los Angeles, we have several gas-fired power plants, including one Valley generating station out in the northeastern San Fernando Valley, which, like many of these low-income, largely Latino community out there that have all sorts of sources of pollution. And this one in the valley was a Valley generating station, which is operated by LADWP, spent several years leaking methane and other, lower levels of other pollutants into these communities, and DWP knew about it and didn't tell the public. I wrote a story about this a few years ago, and it was just this sort of shockwave through these neighborhoods in the valley when DWP finally came out and admitted it. And understandably, the attitude was, "What the hell? This has been going on for 3 years, and you didn't tell us until just now." So those voices are fortunately being raised up more and more, and are able to been able to make themselves heard. And on the renewable energy side of things too. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of benefits to be had here in terms of, again, jobs and taxes and just cleaner air and cleaner communities. And you've also got to take it seriously when a tribe says, this is our culturally sacred land and we don't think you should put a solar farm there. Or when a community here in the city says, maybe it'll cost a little extra money compared to a solar farm out in the desert, but we'd like a small community solar installation to serve our communities and our apartments to help us clean up the air here. It's a hugely important part of the conversation.
You're reminding me. There's a midrash. There's a commentary on the story of the building of the Tower of Babel, and I know we've taught it in this community before, but the midrash is that when the builders of Babel, which we should say that at least from the Torah's perspective is a building project that the Torah looks down on, right? It's not a positive building project for a variety of reasons. That's for a different conversation. But the critique of the builders that the rabbis of the Midrash offer is that when in the process of building, when a person would fall to their death, not a tear was shed, but when a brick fell, right, woe is us, a fallen brick, how will we replace it? Right? So what the rabbis say is that the moral tragedy of the project of the building of the Tower of Babel was the confusion over the value of life versus the value of what was being built. And I think of that when you talk about, some of these companies which have concealed their findings in terms of the ways that their behavior has... You're
talking about the oil companies that knew about climate change for decades and decades and hid the truth and tried to convince us otherwise.
Right, at the cost of human lives and in the pursuit of their profit.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to in a moment turn to you all to see what questions you have. But since we're having this conversation in this particular space in this community, I do want to ask you about the Jewish identity that you walk through the world with, and the learning that you've done, and how your Jewishness impacts your reporting, how it impacts the way that you think about climate change, and generally speaking, what you see as the intersection between your Jewish identity and the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for asking that. And I mean, the thing that has always resonated the most with me about Judaism, and the reason why it's, I think, stayed important in my life, is just generally the concept of Judaism being oriented around tikkun olam and healing the world, and based on our experiences through history, it being our responsibility not just to protect ourselves, but to protect others in the whole world as well, and that's sort of a sacred duty that we have. So that's really important to me. And just to be a little more specific, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago during the high holidays. If anyone remembers August of 2020, when still several months into COVID, and we were all stuck at home, and that was the week that we had rolling blackouts, and there were wildfires, and it was super, super hot, and it was just, everything was crazy in that moment. And I wrote a piece and noted that one thing that had really resonated with me then and has resonated with me since is, I think this is from Pirkei Avot, the idea that while it's not your job to finish the work of fixing the world, nor are you free to desist from it, something along those lines. And something that I get with climate change all the time that people bring up is it feels so big and insurmountable. It feels so far, beyond our ability as individuals to do anything about. And that's true. I mean, it's so much bigger than any one of us and can feel insurmountable. But, I think I'd like to think this is everyone's job, but especially us as Jews, I see it as our responsibility to, do our part, even if it feels small and even if it feels insignificant. And from a practicality of solving climate change perspective, there's a similar dynamic at play, I think, where people hear about, we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or if not 1.5, then 2 degrees Celsius. And that is absolutely the case, that we should be working hard. There's a reason that the 195 countries of the world have settled on those targets on the basis of science. But it's not, win or lose. It's not do or die. I mean, absolutely we should be trying to meet those, but every little bit of warming that we avoid is worthwhile. I mean, if we're going to go past 2 degrees, and I hope we don't, but if we do, I'd still much rather live in a world and leave a world for our descendants of 2.1 rather than 2.2, and of 2.5 rather than 3, et cetera, et cetera. So it may not be possible, or it may not be our job to do everything, but we've got to do the best that we can, and that's still better than nothing.
Yeah, I so appreciate you saying that, and part of what I'm hearing in the answer you just gave, but also in some of the answers from earlier, there are certain narratives. The role of narrative in shaping public policy and shaping individual behavior and shaping how we think about the inevitability of something or our power to impact something, right, is part of the work around climate change. There's a shift in narrative that's needed. And maybe different peoples require different narratives to get us moving. But I wonder if you would maybe wrap up this section of the conversation, maybe by highlighting what are 2 or 3 narrative shifts that you would want us walking away from this room with as a different way of reapproaching our relationship and our commitment to the work of fighting climate change.
Well, I'll just do one if that's okay, because I'm realizing that
Sure.
This is something we talked about beforehand that I wanted to make sure I brought up. I think that if you look at polling on the topic of climate change, the vast majority of the American public will tell you that they believe that climate change is real, that it's happening, that humans have a role in it. But then when you look at where it falls on people's priority list, if you ask them what are the issues that are most important to you, immigration, homelessness, the economy, gas prices, et cetera, all important in their own ways, but climate change tends to rank pretty low. So I think I would say if there's a shift in approach that we could all adopt that would be helpful, not to say that there aren't other incredible pressing challenges that we can and should be working on, and I'm glad that this community is working on many of them, but to the extent that we can make climate change something that we don't just agree that it's real and serious when asked about it or when there happens to be something put in front of our face about it, but something that we're really actively focused on when we're figuring out which politicians to vote for and what we want to complain about at the dinner table and what we're posting about on social media and what we're spending our charitable dollars and advocacy time on. I think climate change sort of needs to be, if not at the top, then near the top of the list, and not just something that you know is there, but are not focused on at all.
Okay, can I push you on that? Because to what degree do you think that climate change is a distinct issue from the other priorities?
Oh,
that
it's
you just
related
listed?
to many of them. Yeah, absolutely, it's related to many of them. I mean, to the extent that, housing and homelessness is one for sure. To the extent that we can be building more housing within Los Angeles and more affordable housing within urban areas like this one on the west side, not only is that valuable for getting more people housed and bringing down housing prices, that creates less need to drive long distances and to commute out back and forth from sprawling suburbs. There are versions of that, and it makes public transit more useful. There are versions of that for most of the other issues, and we could get into them individually. But I think you're absolutely right to point that out.
Okay. All right. Thank you to Sammy Roth. He's not done. This part one is done, but you can still clap at the end of part one. It's fine. I wanna give you all a chance to ask this very thoughtful reporter and thinker some of your questions. Scott. Sorry, I'm going to start with Scott Morchow. I realize that two Scotts are sitting next to each other.
Hi, Sammy. Thanks for coming. I've been reading you in LA Times for years, so
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
When I was in Israel, when I was in high school, which was 40 years ago, I noticed all these water tanks on people's roofs, and I asked around, why do you have water tanks on your roofs? And it turns out because it's for solar water heating. And that was 40 years ago, and I was wondering why it's never caught on here. It's not even something, it's almost not even an option. Like if I was to get solar panels on my roof, you can't really even get it with solar heat. Like they don't even sell solar water heaters. So I was wondering, do you know anything about that? Why it's never?
Yeah, that's
okay.
that's a great question, and I will first just say very quickly, because I know that people are probably going to have to get going, and I feel obligated by my employer to plug this first. Thank you for reading the LA Times for many years. As you've probably seen, we've been going through difficult times financially, and there's all sorts of problems with we just had a huge round of layoffs, and it's not just on readers and residents of Los Angeles to help us solve that, but to the extent that you are able to subscribe to the newspaper and help us sustain the work that we're doing, that's something that's going to be needed in the long term. So thank you for that. So solar water heating is an interesting one. I will admit that I don't know as much about it as I would like to. I did a couple of stories on it when I was reporting in the desert back before I was at the LA Times, and I think at this point the sort of technology that you hear the most about, that sort of has the most hype among the advocacy community, and probably for good reason, is heat pump water heaters. There's a really big push to electrify as many of our home appliances and just general day-of-life activities as possible, electric driving, electric heating, electric cooking, et cetera. And so heat pumps to heat the home and heat pump water heaters to heat water, I think are probably going to end up being the sort of most common, economically efficient option. But yeah, that's a good question. Solar hot water heating has been a workable technology for a long time, and I'm not sure why it hasn't been more widely adopted. It's a good question. Thank you for asking.
Thanks. Oh, there's Scott. Okay. I've never asked this question before, but I've thought about it for many, many years, that there seems to be a great lack of leadership in terms of getting people to change their habits. And we've had PSAs for so many things: stop smoking, seatbelts, just say no. But I just haven't seen anything really from any administration, any mayor's office about changing habits in terms of conservation. And I've never really asked this question before, but I've always been personally frustrated by it, and I just wanted to know if you had any take on that.
Also a good question that I don't have a great answer for. I agree with you. One of the best and most important things we can be doing is using less energy, and because then you need to build less stuff. It's less expensive. It's less politically difficult. It's just better for the preserving resources that are coming into conflict with renewable energy development, as we've discussed. I think probably one area where we're going to be seeing and hearing a lot more about it that's already gotten started is shifting what times of day we use energy and being more efficient in when we use electricity, and that's being driven by the fact of, we have abundant electricity during the middle of the afternoon right now, especially in the spring and summer when all of the solar panels are generating. Not so much at other times of day when they aren't. There's efforts underway at the state level, and I'm sure at various local levels too, to give people a financial incentive in the way that electricity bills are structured to to the extent that you can charge your EV in the afternoon or have your air conditioning set to automatically turn on at 2 or 3 when there's abundant power out there and pre-cool your home so that when you get home and there's a shortage at 5 or 6, you've kind of already pre-cooled the place. I think there's going to be more messaging and more incentivization on that front. Why we haven't done a better job with it so far, another good question that I don't have a great answer to.
Hi. I realize that you can't speak for sort of the editorial policy of the full LA Times, but
I wish I could.
Yeah, I know. There's a perception in the environmental community that the LA Times is pretty actively hostile to electric vehicles. There's just a relentless weekly, if not more, articles in the Times that sort of critique EVs and very harsh on EVs, and not in your writing in particular, but more largely in the Times. And it's almost within the environmental community, people talk about it and wonder why, but I don't know if you could give any insight on that, or if there's anything that you could say about that, or I don't want to get you in trouble with your employers. But
no, it's okay. I guess I personally, I think that's a perception, and forgive me if you think I'm mischaracterizing, that's especially common among really strong advocates of electric vehicles and among people who are, I don't mean this just financially, but who are really invested in the electric vehicle space and spend a lot of time thinking and talking about that, and maybe that you're a part of that, I'm not sure. But I assume you read Russ Mitchell and probably have some frustrations with my colleague Russ Mitchell. Yeah. No, I hear from Russ's critics all the time. I'm going to defend Russ. Probably not too surprised to hear that. I think there's Russ writes, and I think this is where that perception among some folks that you're describing comes from. Russ writes a lot about what are the problems with electric vehicles. He's written a number of pieces and had some pieces just this week about chargers not working as much or as often as they should, about range anxiety, and about, he's written all sorts of stuff that's not, climate or environmentally related as well, about Elon Musk and Tesla and some of the problematic financial stuff that they seemingly have been involved with. Others disagree with that. I guess what I would say, though, is that there are definitely people who I think would criticize my work as being anti-renewable energy, even when I write with a clear message of we need to build a lot of renewable energy and solve climate change with it. I could spend all my time just writing about here are the problems with fossil fuels, and there are a lot of reporters who do that, and I'm glad there are. I wish we had more of them. I think that a role that I'm trying to serve that isn't well served elsewhere, not as well served that it needs to be, are what are the obstacles and challenges that we need to sort through and overcome, because realistically those political challenges and economic and technical challenges, although I think they're more political at this point, are out there, and if we don't grapple with those, we're not going to get to where we need to be. I see Russ's reporting in the same light. I think that we absolutely need to get to a place of high penetration of electric vehicles across society, and that's going to be a really key part of solving climate change. And I don't think that's going to happen if we're not honest and realistic about what are the problems that need to get solved and what are the challenges to people wanting to invest in these cars and wanting to drive them, and how do we get around them. If you feel differently about his coverage or other pieces that the paper may write, I get that. Lord knows I'd go back and change some of the stuff that I'd written in the past if I could help it. But that would be my take on that topic. Thank you for asking the question.
I'm going to come back this way, but I'm going to start over here to and get to Sean, who works in this field.
Hi, thank you so much, Sammy. I really appreciate all the nuance that you bring to these issues, and appreciate the conversation. I'm going to follow up with another question kind of about the journalism side of this. Mm-hmm. So you've been both a reporter and a columnist.
Yes, I've only been a columnist for 4 months now, still figuring it out.
and I'm really curious about that, because you bring reporting to your, I think one of the good things about the LA Times historically is that it has this tradition of columnists who aren't just op-ed writers who sit somewhere and express an opinion about something, but people, Steve Lopez and other people like that, who actually are fundamentally are reporters, but then they write columns. And I'm curious about how that has been for you and what you see as the role of a columnist versus a reporter for yourself, because I do think you bring things to both of those roles, and they're different things. I'm just really super curious about it.
No, that's a great question, Sean. I appreciate your asking it. I guess I would say that it felt a bit like a natural evolution for me, because just through the newsletter that I've been writing the last few years, through Boiling Point, I've been trending in the direction of writing more first person, bringing more personal perspective to stories, sharing, here's what it was like behind the scenes reporting this one, here's why I'm focusing on these issues, here's why I'm writing about them in the way I am, here are my own hopes and anxieties. So I was kind of already bringing that to the reporting, but I think that there's a super valuable role still. I'm not surprised to hear me say this, probably for reporters who don't do that, for those who are, I don't want to say just the facts, because I feel like that's a little bit of an outmoded way of thinking about journalism. I think it's always been important and continues to be important that we provide context, that we are careful in picking and choosing about what we do and don't include, that we don't just, here's what everyone involved in the matter said, and, I'm going to leave it to you to sort through that. I think that that's sort of a false vision of what journalism has always been and what journalism should be, and I didn't ever take that approach to my work, and I think that my fellow reporters on the environmental desk and most others at the Times don't take that approach to their work either. But yeah, I think that with climate change in particular, and with the stuff that we're talking about today, it feels to me like people are looking for more guidance on, what should we be most scared of, what should give us hope, how should we sort through these, really big, pressing, important, but also sometimes terrifying topics. And I think that is one of the reasons why I started moving in that sort of column-style direction in my writing, and why I've now fully adopted that, because I think that just provides additional value and perspective that people are looking for as they sort through these topics that can feel, scary and foreign and, just maybe not so familiar in your day-to-day lives. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, let me hear, and then we'll do like.
Hi, thank you for being here. And I'm going to talk about a poor stepchild in this conversation, which is hydrogen-powered cars, which I own. And
you're one of the 3,000 or 4,000 in the state, I think.
That's right. But
it might be a little higher than that. But I know it's in the 4 digits.
Right. And I was incentivized by the state of California to get one. So what's your take on hydrogen moving forward?
Great question. Thank you for asking. In the vehicle space in particular, it's hard for me to see, a lot of reason to think there's a huge future there, certainly for passenger vehicles. I mean, I don't know what your experience has been like, if it's been a good experience or not.
Well, it's been rough because it's hard to find hydrogen sometimes.
Yeah, hard to find the fueling stations, right? Yeah, I mean, the state of California has expended a bunch of money on that and continues to. I think in the last budget, my recollection, I want to say there was like another $100 or $125 million or some large figure for hydrogen fueling stations and hydrogen fuel cell cars. Seems like that's been motivated by pretty good lobbying by the industry behind that. The fact that it's been something that the state has been incentivizing going back to, I think, the Schwarzenegger administration, and we haven't seen more adoption than we have, is probably just not a great sign for where it's going, especially seeing how electric vehicles have taken off and how the costs there have declined. Potentially more value in the trucking sector and long distance, larger vehicles. Again, not a lot has happened yet, but seems like the economics there may make more sense. I mean, I think with hydrogen, what you're seeing now, and it sounds like you've probably been following this, but for those who haven't, there's been a really significant federal investment through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act that started to roll out to focus not on vehicles, but on hydrogen for heavy industrial applications that right now burn a lot of fossil fuels to generate heat, and hydrogen potentially for electricity generation to replace natural gas peaker power plants that fire up on a moment's notice. There's other uses of hydrogen, and those all have their pluses and minuses and environmental justice components and debates happening surrounding them. But I think that it's more likely to see hydrogen take off in some of those other spaces than in the vehicle space, where it's clearly been quite slow.
All right, we'll take two more questions and then wrap
Thank
up.
you. I've also read your column for a long time.
Thank you.
I love the balanced aspect to it. Some people, criticize you for, but I
If I wasn't
find-
getting criticized by somebody, I'd be doing something wrong. So.
Yeah, that's right. So my question is, in terms of this balance issue, one of the countervailing currents in terms of our fossil fuel production in the United States are our geopolitical interests in Europe. So we're trying to get the Europeans sort of weaned off Russian oil and natural gas. So where does that interest sort of figure in terms of the balance of how we're trying to cut down, obviously, on fossil fuel production, but we also don't want Germany to have to buy from Putin. So
Yeah,
what do
it's
you
a
do
good
about
question.
that conundrum?
So I'll start by saying that, one, it's a good question, and two, I don't have the answer, and if I did, I'd be doing something else probably. That's a hard one. Just for context for everybody else, I'm guessing you're probably familiar with this. The United States over the last 15 years since the advent of hydraulic fracturing or fracking has become, a much bigger producer of oil and natural gas. And there was a deal made during the Obama administration to allow companies to start exporting natural gas overseas, which was not allowed before. And as a result, there are all sorts of companies that are building or proposing to build these natural gas export terminals, mostly on the Gulf Coast, to send natural gas to Europe and mostly to Asia before, and now is the Ukraine situation seemingly shifting to Europe where there's that need. It's tough. The geopolitics are what they are. Clearly, there's a reason that there's been more support for that, and I with the Ukraine war in Ukraine, and I get that. Climate change is also a geopolitical issue, and I think that it's important that that doesn't get lost in the situation. With some of the worst impacts in terms of heat and in terms of drought and in terms of flooding and other weather catastrophes that are being made worse by climate change are happening in parts of the world where you already have refugee flows from lower income into higher income countries. And there's been a lot of research done having to do with Syria and North Africa, suggesting that as climate change gets worse and worse, we're probably going to see more and more people displaced and attempting to move from the countries where they're in now to higher income countries in Europe and in the United States, coming from south of here. So I'm not saying that's good or bad. It is what it is, but that's something that we need to take into account as well if we're talking geopolitics and climate change. And just this week, President Biden announced that he was going to be putting a pause on I'm sure you saw this, a pause on this approval process for many of these natural gas export terminals on the Gulf Coast, that rather than just sort of signing off on them, as a matter of policy, as has been the case in the past, that they're going to stop and consider what are the climate change impacts of these export terminals. So I'm sure that both sides of these conversations with the geopolitics are playing into that decision-making process as well. So it's a hard one. It doesn't change the fact that we need to ultimately get to a point where we're burning a lot less of all fossil fuels, including natural gas, very, very quickly, but I understand why that needs to be taken into account as well.
All right, Tony, you're the last one here.
Thank you for the question.
Privilege. Thank you so much for coming. You were talking about energy storage, shortage of energy during daylight hours. We have a glut of it. What do you see as the future for energy storage? And if you covered this, I stepped out for a moment, but we have solar panels and they're phenomenally good and they charge our little EV cars, but obviously energy storage is a big part of this. So what is your crystal ball telling you?
Like I said, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think the experience of the last few years in California is starting to show that energy storage not only has a big role to play in the future, but is already playing a pretty significant role here. We had, going back to lithium-ion batteries, which are the big source of energy storage so far, we had in August 2020 in California, as I think I referenced earlier, those rolling blackouts, which were relatively brief in nature, a couple of hours in parts of the state, but is the kind of thing that we badly don't want to get worse and are politically very detrimental to the sort of clean energy cause. At that point, 3.5 or 3 years and a couple months ago, there was very, very little battery storage on the power grid in California. Since then, thousands of megawatts have been built. I forget the exact number, but I want to say in 2023, something like 5,000 or 6,000 or 7,000 megawatts of battery storage were added to the grid. I know that number is probably meaningless to most people, but from 0 to 5,000 or 6,000 or 7,000 megawatts is a big deal, and I think one of the big reasons why we haven't had another incident like we did in August 2020 is all the storage that's being built right now. So, yeah, storage at the electric grid level, storage in the home with rooftop solar panels, to the extent that the costs keep coming down and we can figure out ways to make it easier financially for people to make that investment. I think that's going to be huge. Lithium-ion batteries don't solve the whole problem. We also need longer duration. I don't know that we need to go into quite all this detail, but we need other types of energy storage too, and this is the beginning.
Do you think residential storage is going to be the future, or like large capacity?
All of it. All of it. I mean, that's an easy answer, but I've tried to emphasize this across a lot of my coverage. It's really easy for people to sort of lock into one particular type of clean energy or climate change solution because it's such a big and overwhelming issue that it's much easier to see it through the lens of if only we did this one or two particular things. And for some people that's rooftop solar, and for some people it's nuclear energy, and for some people it's hydrogen or batteries or eating less meat or driving less or building more public transit. And ultimately the amount of fossil fuels we're burning and the emission sources, there are so many of them, it's so overwhelming, it's so deeply ingrained in everyday life, it's hard for me to not imagine a way that we resolve that without a little bit of, if not quite everything, then most things. Welcome.
All right. Big thank you to Sammy Roth.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And if you want to get the Boiling Point newsletter that I write, latimes.com/boilingpoint. You don't have to subscribe to the Times for that, although I know I'd love that too. But latimes.com/boilingpoint. You can sign up for that for free. It's okay. That's my dad. Thank you.
Well, now we know where to go to get childhood stories of Sammy. So thanks for revealing yourself. So again, a big thank you, and I just wanna encourage folks, as I said when I started, to get in touch with our Green Action leadership, with Elisa and Cipra and Lisa and Scott. And just put your hands up in the air. Right, as I said at the beginning, these are the folks who live the truth of this being a year-round cause to get involved with. And so if you heard something today or you're intrigued by the local work that we're doing in this regard, the ballot measures and so forth, please get in touch with our leadership and let's get working. Shabbat Shalom.